You're listening to Radio Free Mike. Welcome to Radio Free Mike, the podcast about freedom and its discontents. My name is Michael Scott Moore, coming to you from Los Angeles, California, and today we're talking to Peter Theroux, another LA writer, technically speaking, who's got an enormous amount of international experience like the rest of his famous family. He spent 2 decades in the CIA, living in Washington as well as the Middle East, and he's just published a book about those years called In Obscura, which is only one part of the memoirs he plans to publish about his life in the shadows. We'll talk about that, as well as Syria, a nation he obviously loves, and where it seems to be headed since last year when its long and brutal civil war came to an end. Peter, welcome.
Thank you, Michael. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Very well, thanks.
Good. So you live in LA, you're an LA writer, and you're also the author of Translating LA, which is a sort of travel book about living in Los Angeles. And you're also a translator of Arabic.
That's all correct.
And your last name is not a coincidence. You come from the famous family of Theroux, which includes your brothers, Paul and Alexander, who are both excellent writers, and some nephews and sons who became actors and broadcasters, Justin and Louis Theroux.
Yeah, Louis in London. He's very well known in London. He's won BAFTAs. His elder brother, Marcel. Their cousin,
Marcel,
my nephew, Justin, he's getting married in a few weeks. And
who's been in some David Lynch movies.
Yeah, 2 of the very most striking ones, Mulholland Drive and Inland Empire. Yeah. Yes, indeed.
I love Mulholland Drive. So Thanksgiving at your place must be amazing.
Not as much as it used to be because we are so scattered. But the summer family reunions are remarkable if you can get a word in edgewise, which very often I cannot.
I see. Everybody's noisy. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people know Paul's books, but I wanted to say that I really enjoyed Alexander's book too, Primary Colors.
Alex is a very odd duck. He writes really unusual and lovely fiction and nonfiction. He's written novels. He's also a very good poet. A lot of strings to Alex's bows. We have a lesser-known brother, Joseph, who writes mysteries, detective novels. But so, there was something in the drinking water in the northern suburbs of Boston.
Amazing. So your book is about the 2 decades that you spent in the CIA, In Obscura. It's a new book. It came out late last year. But it's just part 1 of the memoir, or the full memoir you're going to write about those years. Why is it just part 1?
Because I still hold a clearance in the U.S. government, which is the term of art for the bureaucratic state where you have access to classified or sensitive information up to the top secret level. So when you start working for the agency, or indeed anybody in the U.S. government, the Department of State or Defense or Treasury, where you're going to have access to that information, your first day on the job, you sign a secrecy agreement saying, I will not violate the rules. And also I promise to submit for pre-publication review everything I write from now on and forever, during and after employment. So the deal there is that I've done that. I've done that scrupulously, but it does limit what you can say, because if you quit the U.S. government and just run away, they only review what you've written for to make sure you're not putting sensitive or classified information out where it does not belong, out of channels, they would say.
Right.
But if you still are employed by the U.S. government, or even just vaguely, if you just hold a clearance, I'm no longer employed, I'm retired, but I still have a TS, a top secret clearance. So there's a higher level. I may not make judgmental or what might be perceived as biased comments about our allies or about U.S. policy. I'm held to the standard of a full-time current employee. So I was disappointed that when I submitted my draft to the pre-publication review people of In Obscura, the book you were referring to, there were a few redactions, not many, because I know how to step carefully. But when I asked them, like, why, you redacted something and it's not classified information, I just said the ambassador of such and such a country is a jerk. I knew him in Washington, and he's kind of a jackass, and they said, well, that's an ally, and they said you're limited in what you can say, because that foreign government or any reader could see, oh, Peter Theroux, who works for that agency, clearly has a bias or strong personal opinions. How can he be objective? So they said very quickly, that's because of you haven't let go of the clearance. They say anytime you want to vacate it, you can say anything about the U.S. president, any U.S. official, foreign domestic policy, our allies. Go to town on everybody. But so I thought, okay, I can get half of this off my chest right now, and then in part two, I will probably this year be getting rid of the clearance, and then so part two will be a little bit snarkier. I mean, it'll be interesting. I hope other ways than that, but that's the short way of why there's part one and two.
So you'll be freer with some information, but you'll also be able to call some people jerks.
Yeah, I was. Yeah, in part one, I referred to. So I spent some time in Baghdad, Iraq, for the U.S. government doing intelligence work, and as an analyst and targeter as I was the right hand of the big man out there who was too busy to deal with visiting congressional delegations, CODELs as they're called, and so forth. So it was my job to offer intelligence briefings to arriving U.S. officials. It could be, I don't know, Martin Indyk. In one case, it was head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Joseph Biden, future president, Carl Levin of Missouri, many others. And, some of these are public servants, flying through a lot of time zones to do real work. And sometimes they want to go shopping, or the spouse wants to go shopping. They just want to look tough, as our British friends say, a little hairy-chestedness on the cheap by going into some place where they're hanging around soldiers. And so I made some fairly snarky remarks, and it was one of the things that they redacted. I said someone was stupid or a waste of time, and he was just there for a photo op, and they took a little bit of that out. And so then I just said, well, this individual was, garrulous and a poor listener. And I think I got away with something like that. So you stepped like a mountain goat.
Okay. So the second half is going to be a little more gossipy too. So.
Yeah. And also cover more family issues and broader issues. Let me note, Mike, that you mentioned my book, Translating LA, which is this sort of travel memoir of Los Angeles, but it isn't a travel book where you go on a journey.
No,
I've written about places I've lived. I wrote a book called Sandstorms about the Middle East, about the years I spent in Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and places like that. Published by W.W. Norton. A successor book was about L.A., about the history and the present day. Why basically I love L.A. And I always thought I would do a Washington book. And so parts 1 and 2 of In Obscura are about what the people at CIA do all day, and the White House and the war zones, and a little bit of the Middle East in there. Not as a National Geographic writer as I had been, or a teacher as I was in Egypt, but as an intelligence officer involved in some of the trouble of the area.
Yeah, some of it is set in Washington or in the suburbs in Langley and all that kind of thing.
That's right.
But it starts out really, really persuasively in Syria. You're sitting in Damascus, I think beside a pool at a hotel, pretending to read the Ba'athist Party propaganda paper, but you've got an earpiece in your ear, and you're actually listening to your shortwave radio.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So oddly enough, there were a lot of good reasons. The book opens in Syria. Of course, Syria then subsequently came into the news in a very, very big way. But I was making a point. That chapter is called "I Hate My Boss." Yeah, and my boss is me, because I was self-employed.
You were working for yourself at that point. Yeah.
Yes, and I was thinking I need a change.
Hmm.
But that was illustrated by some of the very, very complicated dynamics I experienced in, what was one of my favorite places, Syria, particularly the incredibly ancient and fascinating capital, Damascus. And
Hmm.
I was leading a double life there. The really great, unfortunately late author Abdurrahman Munif, whose books I translated, was leading a
Hmm.
sort of a double life there. He was a Saudi exile. You have to
Hmm.
play by the rules when you're living in a dictatorship like that, the Assad
Right.
dynasty dictatorship. He's there because his wife was Syrian.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, I was in and out of Syria a fair amount as a friend of Munif and his family, because
Hmm.
again, as a literary translator, being
Right.
published by Random House and Pantheon at the time. Then I was
Hmm.
back again for National Geographic, and
Right.
so through a prism of that, a nice country with nice people, bad government, state sponsor of terror. My way into it was through its artists and writers. That
Hmm.
that was just that was the way into the different stories in the book.
Right. And the following night, after that scene by the pool, the following night you went to a painter's apartment, I think with your friend Munif,
Yep,
the
yep.
writer, and you went to a very good painter's apartment, and he was showing you his new paintings, and one of them was a portrait of some turned out to be some young Palestinian men.
Yeah, it was
Um,
not any young Palestinian man. It was a portrait, and technically and artistically, it was a very skillful and impressive portrait. Yeah, and as you observe from having read that part in the book, it was explained to me and all the other onlookers admiring the painting. These were the lion cubs who slaughtered the Zionists in Munich. I'm
mhm,
thinking,
mhm.
what in the hell? So they were the
Yeah,
PFLP, Black September, whatever, terrorists who abducted
yeah.
and tortured and massacred people. And I was thinking, oh, holy cow, this is not comfortable. But that's a taste of what you get. A room full of very fine people. I don't know, we might call them, but or and not, but not so fine an atmosphere in one way. And I
Yeah,
thought
it was so tense. I
it,
like
it
that.
it was quite tense. And how do you? I'm not going to say, oh wow, good for them. Kill all the athletes, kill the
Right.
Jews. You have to think, well, how do I be a person I can look at myself in the mirror and not go with the flow here, but also be tactful. I'm a guest in the country. I'm a guest in the house. And
Yeah.
so related to that is in the chapter, which also involves going down to the Golan Heights
Hmm.
at the Lebanon, Israel, Syria border, a sort of triangle there down there near Mount Hermon. I was experiencing things that if conventionally writing for conventional outlets, that it's hard or impossible to write about. Because if you're
Hmm.
writing for National Geographic or Condé Nast Traveler, as I had done, and
Hmm.
you can be critical, you can be favorable, you can be descriptive. You meet artists and writers and carpet sellers, but when you
Hmm.
run into corruption and certain kinds of ugliness, especially when it involved some of the Syrian regime people in the Ministry of Information, who were my minders. It also happened in Egypt. You think,
Hmm.
this is uncomfortable. The magazine, the National Geographic Society, will not welcome this kind of drive-by of the
Hmm.
people that they need to maintain a relationship with. If
Right.
we're going to maintain, I can't burn access to their country. So
No.
I thought, okay, well, this has to go in a book, because no one else is going to let me really say so.
Hmm. Yeah, well, and I mean that's a dynamic with journalists covering anybody who's powerful. But I mean, especially those magazines that you're talking about, they weren't doing hard hitting journalism, so they wouldn't want somebody to sort of burn their access. I mean, the National Geographic would want to go back to Egypt every decade or so, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. I was
Yeah.
told that by the geographic people. I'm not saying anything derogatory about them. They stated
Mm.
as a fact. I did numerous Egyptian assignments for them.
Hmm.
They said, look, Egypt and China are the most difficult. They're the touchiest about their
Hmm.
image, because
About their image. Yeah. Hmm.
Egypt wants to have the golden King Tut mask on the
Right.
cover of the magazine. And
As often as
and
possible.
lots of pyramids and Valley of the Kings,
Right.
poverty, pollution. And they said the Chinese, let alone Xinjiang and some of those sensitive demographic issues, they said the Chinese gave them a horrible time. But they maintain their relationship, they maintain their integrity, but it's easy does it. I ran into, I go into in Obscura Part 1, some of the Egyptian issues I encountered. Part 2 is going to have a far more elaborate, crazy adventure that played out all throughout the Nile Delta. I was the writer, field worker, as they call it. I was working with an Iranian photographer who had a brother in Israel who was a journalist. His brother was back and forth between Israel and Egypt to visit his brother, Reza Dalati, the photographer. There were misunderstandings and suspicions that made our entire assignment there a cat and mouse, because the Egyptians became persuaded that we were not who we said we were. We both got detained ultimately, separately. So Egypt, a lot of places are a minefield, so to speak, not just the crazy places, normal places too.
Well, in the run up to the Iraq War, that was a problem too for mainstream news organizations, and I mean places like the New York Times and CNN, whose job it was to write critically about these places for a U.S. audience. They had to flatter Saddam in order to keep access to him, and it's the same problem in Washington right now. I mean, then anyone covering Trump is going to have to flatter Trump and put out some positive stuff as well as anything critical.
That's that thing. Remember, I guess shortly, not that long after Trump won the election, MSNBC went down to kiss the ring. I mean, one of the most critical networks. And
the Morning Joe people,
yeah, exactly right. Scarborough and his colleague. So you don't want to get shut out. You want to keep your access. CNN, admitted it pulled its punches in Saddam's Iraq, because if we tell the truth, we're going to be gone. I mean, we'll, at best, we'll be kicked out. At worst, God knows what will happen to us in a dungeon. I mean, the New York Times had a history of that in the Soviet Union with the famous or notorious Walter Duranty. So so in my case, it was absolutely nothing like that. The Egyptians hated the fact that I was talking to scientists about heavy metals in the Nile River and waste.
About pollution.
Terrible. I mean, there are parts of Egypt, a country we all love so much, that are just nightmarish. The ecological picture is just terrible. And look, this was not a touristy or a tourist or travel magazine. National Geographic has a strong scientific string to its bow. They write about sunken ships and outer space and diseases and animals and deserts. And so it's like, sorry, I got to kind of do this. So no. So I did have it easy compared to any of them.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but this has been a free preview of this episode. And the whole thing is open to paid subscribers to Radio Free Mike. So if you'd like to hear the rest, please hit the link in your show notes or in the body of the email we've sent you and upgrade your subscription over at Substack. Then you'll be able to listen to the full episode on any platform. Thanks for listening.